Jesus is really a fantastic teacher, isn't he? The Bible really is a great place to learn more and more about God. But in the Bible, there are all different sorts of types of writings recorded, different genres within the Bible. We have history, we have narrative, like this, we have legal writings, everybody's favorite books. And then we have poetry, but we also have what has been called to be known as wisdom literature. Over the next few weeks, we'll be looking at one of those books. We'll be looking at the book of Proverbs. Not all of it, mind you. There's a lot there. But we'll be looking at different categories and how they relate to each other. How one way to live is how you receive a blessing, and another way you live is the way to be cursed. That's the way many proverbs are written. They compare and contrast two opposing types of people. But before we dive into that, I believe it's really necessary to teach a little bit about Proverbs as a book, as a whole. It's likely that you've read Proverbs before. If you've been a Christian for some time, and reading Proverbs, you may have noticed, it's not like reading much of the rest of the Bible. It's kind of random at times. It jumps from topic to topic, and there's not very much structure as compared to the rest of the Bible up to this point, except maybe the book of Psalms. However, inside of Proverbs, there is some structure that was put in place there by the original authors, and I thought it was fascinating, and I thought it might help you as you read through Proverbs in your future. In the Bible, there are headings, right? If you've read through it, you see these bold black letters, heading. At the very, very beginning of the Bible, the very first chapter, before the very first word, it says a heading, the beginning. You go to the very last page of the Bible before Revelation 22, verse 12, there's another heading, epilogue, invitation and warning. You may wonder, why are these here? Well, these headings are there. They've been added after the fact to help us, to serve as a guide for us, to help us to understand the movements of the text. And most of them have been added after the fact. They're in bold and black because they want you to know that this was an original. But in Proverbs, there are headings. They're in there. They were originally written in the book of Proverbs, and these headings are what divides the book of Proverbs and help us to understand more about the flow of the book, how it works. It divides the different categories of Proverbs. The first one is in Proverbs 1, verse 1. It says, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. Well, that's a pretty apt heading, but if we read the first section of Proverbs, which goes from Proverbs 1 until the end of chapter 9, these are Proverbs, but it's all about wisdom, and wisdom as a person. It is instruction being given to a metaphorical son about receiving wisdom, and receiving wisdom as a person, and pursuing wisdom as a person. It continues in this manner until chapter 10, and then it makes a turn. From that, we get to the Proverbs of Solomon. That's the new heading. It seems really similar to the first one, but it's so much different. In the structure until nearly the end of chapter 22, we have an assortment of one-liners. The best one-liners in the world, the Proverbs of Solomon. Scholars have agreed, though, that you may have thought, reading through Proverbs, that Solomon wrote all of these Proverbs. Every single one of them he came up with. But scholars have agreed that Solomon didn't write them all. He may have written some, but based on the perspective of most of them as agrarian and different people, not as a king, but as ordinary people, that rather than writing them himself, he gathered them. Solomon was the wisest man that ever lived, the Bible tells us, but he didn't have all the wisdom himself. He learned it from others. And so these Proverbs of Solomon in this section are likely gathered throughout all the nation of Israel. He collected this wisdom for one reason, to teach to young people. These Proverbs were memorized and a great source of instruction for the youth, to transform their entire lives, of helping them to follow the Lord and to be wise, along with the law that they had to follow, the first 5 books of the Bible. That's how they learned how to interact and behave. They didn't have classrooms and teachers. They sat and they learned Proverbs and they learned the law, and that's how they learned to interact with each other. Our next heading is in Proverbs 22, verse 17. It simply says, saying one. And then in a few verses later, it says, saying two. And it goes on until you get to saying 30. These, again, are sort of random, and they serve the same purpose as the last section, but they're more than one verse long. They're roughly 4 or 5 verses long, and they help us more and more teachings. Then we have the next section in 24. These also are saying of the wise. Same thing. Continues again. And then we have another section. Proverbs 25, verse 23, it says, these are more Proverbs of Solomon, compiled by the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah. You may wonder, who in the world is Hezekiah? Well, Hezekiah was a king. He was a king of Judah 14 generations after Solomon. And so you wonder, how are these Proverbs of Solomon? This was 14 generations later. That's a long time. If you count a generation as 30 years, 14 times 30, you get up there. 400 or so years later, we have Proverbs of Solomon. And some of these are repeated from the earlier Proverbs, but they serve a purpose to show the transformation of time of Israel and how Proverbs still serve a purpose to change people's lives. And then we have 2 more sections at the end. We have the sayings of Agur, son of Jakah, an inspired utterance, and the sayings of King Lemuel, an inspired utterance his mother taught him. And we don't know who these 2 people are. We have literally no idea who Agur or Lemuel are. They're not in the Bible anywhere else. You may wonder, why are they important? I don't know, but the Bible it records them as people who matter. And there's unique teachings that truly teach us in a different way. That's an overview of Proverbs. Look at that. We went through it. And I know it's a lot, right? There's a lot in that book. We're not going to cover everything in the book of Proverbs over the next few weeks. We're just going to be looking at a little bit of it. And we're going to quickly today cover just a little bit of the beginning. What is wisdom? What is it really? How do we start getting it? How do we figure out how to start? Why is Proverbs included? And it really comes down to this one idea. Proverbs is included in the Bible to help us to pursue wisdom rather than to be foolish. If we want to be blessed, we are to pursue wisdom. If we want to be cursed, we simply be foolish. And in the original Hebrew, fool, it doesn't mean someone who's dumb. It rather means someone who is morally deficient, who doesn't do what is right. They do what is wrong repeatedly, intentionally, and does not pursue what is wise. They don't change their attitude or behavior based on the instructions of others. What then is wisdom? How do we start to understand this? To understand what wisdom is, we really just need to read the first 9 chapters of Proverbs. But that's a lot of scripture. So we're not going to read it all to you today. It would take me like 35 minutes. And I don't think you want that. But today we're going to summarize all of what Proverbs 1 and through 9 say about wisdom and how it starts. It starts with this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. And also the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. These 2 passages are very similar, are they not? They both start with the fear of the Lord, but they help us in different ways. They help us to understand most of what Proverbs is about. It's about wisdom and instruction and knowledge and teaching wisdom to many. But the beginning of wisdom, the beginning of knowledge, is this: it's fear of the Lord. So to begin to understand and to get wisdom, in order to apply the rest of Proverbs to our life, we must have this. We must have fear of the Lord. This phrase is used across the Old Testament and is a positive thing. And it's used to describe the fear that comes from how much people revere, worship, and are awestruck and are terrified by the Lord. Fear of the Lord it's kind of a hard concept to understand because of the negative connotations of fear in our culture. But this, rather than being negative fear, is positive fear. To help you understand this idea a little better, think about this. We fear fire. Fire is dangerous. Not because we don't like fire, but because of its nature. Fire consumes, it burns up, it destroys. But it also cleans, warms, it runs our cars, our infrastructure, it makes it way more comfortable in here on Sunday. We fear fire, rightly. Teach our kids, don't touch the fire, it's hot, you'll get burned. But yet, we love it and use it. In a similar way, we are to fear God. His nature is just. He can destroy, judge, and smite us. He has that power. But instead, he gives us grace. He loves us and guides us. We should fear God because of who he is. The awesome power and wonder that the creator of the universe is the one that we worship. Wisdom comes from fear of the Lord. Knowledge comes and it begins with the fear of the Lord. If we want to be wise and knowledgeable, we must fear the Lord and then follow his instruction. Proverbs teaches us some of his instructions, but first we must fear the Lord and allow our fear and respect of him to mold us into someone who is wise and not a fool who does what is wrong. We need to be someone who's allowed the Lord to change our hearts, to be people who do what is right and not to be morally sufficient. While everything else in Proverbs builds wisdom, without fear of the Lord, the rest of Proverbs is in vain. If you give Proverbs to anyone else, it's not a Christian, and they try and follow them, they will see it's lacking. It doesn't actually tell you how you're supposed to live. It does, but only in the context of understanding the law that God put in place. To be kind to one another, to love one another. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of the foundation of wisdom. It's understood that young Jewish people would believe in the Lord and follow his instruction that were in the law. Proverbs builds upon the law and teaches how to be wise and at times how to apply that to their lives. Everything in Proverbs builds upon the idea of fearing the Lord, believing in him and following him. Without that, you cannot be wise. You cannot be wise, according to Proverbs, without fearing God. You must fear the Lord and follow his instruction. Today, as Christians, although this instruction was originally written for young Jews, we should still follow it today because of what Jesus said and what others in the New Testament have told us about being wise. As I said to the children, Jesus said in Matthew 7, verse 24, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. It's my hope over the next few weeks as we look more at Proverbs that it can help us all to become more wise, to put the words of Jesus into practice. Be like the wise man who built his house on the rock. I want to encourage you over the next few weeks, if you have time, if you have margin, read through the book of Proverbs, because we're going to be reading and covering quite a bit of it, and it'll get you ahead. You won't be so confused about some of the things that we're talking about. Hopefully it's not confusing, but I would love for you guys to be reading that as well during this time as we talk about Proverbs for the next 4 or 5 weeks. And today, as we close our service together, we'll be putting Jesus' words into practice. We will be taking the words of Jesus and doing them. We'll do this by taking communion together. It's the first Sunday of the month, and we want to take communion together to remember what Jesus did. The greatest act of wisdom and of kindness was that Jesus came and lived a perfect life and then was crucified. We take communion to remember his resurrection and the new covenant made by the shedding of his blood. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 to 28, "For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body broken for you, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way also he took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup.'" I'd like to invite the ushers to please come forward to collect the elements to distribute them. Please hold the elements until everyone has them, and we'll take them together. So please take a quiet moment to reflect on the impact of Jesus' life and his sacrifice on yours.